Hi, and welcome back. In this video, we'll be discussing Jacques Ellul's Propaganda, the Formation of Men's Attitudes, which stands out as one of the first major attempts to understand propaganda from a sociological point of view, rather than a purely psychological or political one. In particular, we'll focus on the second chapter, in which Ellul attempts to describe the social conditions that are conducive or necessary to the success of mass propaganda campaigns. You should read the rest of the book if you have time, because there's a lot of cool stuff in here, but it is too thorough to adequately cover in a single video, and I'd prefer to do a deep dive into an interesting slice of it rather than give you some kind of meandering, broad strokes ChatGPT overview. Although sometimes overshadowed as the go-to propaganda book by Herman and Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent, Ellul's work remains one of the classic analyses of technology and propaganda, blending history, sociology, and psychology towards an impressive range of insights. This video will be centered around a question Ellul poses. How and why does propaganda exist? So who was Jacques Ellul? Many words could be used to describe him: a scholar, a Frenchman, a theologian, a resistance fighter, and, for a time, even a potato farmer. After obtaining his doctorate in 1936 with a thesis titled The History and Legal Nature of the Mancipium, Ellul began teaching at French universities. During the summer that he was 17, while translating Faust alone in the house, a fun and normal summertime activity, Ellul had a religious experience. He claimed he knew he was in the presence of something that entered the very center of his being. He jumped on a bike and fled, concluding eventually that he had been in the presence of God. To me, this sounds kind of like a panic attack or something, but he later became a very devout Christian. He has widely been described as a Christian anarchist, which strikes me as a rare type of person. But I guess that's just what naturally happens when you read the entire works of Marx and Kierkegaard, whom he cited as his favorite scholarly influences. Unfortunately, Professor Ellul was dismissed from his teaching post by the Nazi-collaborating Vichy government in 1940 because of his father's status as a foreigner, and subsequently became a leader of the French resistance movement, a collection of groups that fought the Nazi occupation and the Vichy regime in France during the Second World War. During this time, he took to growing potatoes to support his family. After the war, he became a prolific writer, authoring more than 60 books and 600 articles in his life. He was active in church and civic life in a variety of professional and leadership positions until he died in 1994 at the age of 82 in France. A man of both great thought and action, he is popularly remembered today for coining the phrase, "think globally, act locally." He certainly did both in his lifetime. Ellul's work on propaganda is so incisive in part because of its breadth. So we should figure out what he means when he uses the word propaganda. One of the annoying things we often encounter when reading theory is words that are used to refer to a very broad range of things and cases, and this is one of those situations. I think Ellul would disagree that propaganda should be defined simply, which is probably why he spends a lot of the prelude in Chapter 1 describing the many different ways it looks and operates, but I think we can work out a sufficient summary here. Ellul foremost describes propaganda as an enterprise for perverting the significance of events and of insinuating false intentions. Importantly, for Ellul, we see that propaganda is based more on misdirection than pure fabrication. A good propagandist doesn't make things up. He blows them out of proportion, diminishes them, or misrepresents them. In the prelude, he breaks down propaganda into 4 areas: psychological action, psychological warfare, re-education and brainwashing, and public relations. In psychological action, the propagandist seeks to modify opinions by purely psychological means. Most often, he pursues a semi-educative objective and addresses himself to his fellow citizens. In psychological warfare, the propagandist is dealing with a foreign adversary whose morale he seeks to destroy, so that the opponent begins to doubt the validity of his beliefs and actions. Re-education and brainwashing include complex methods of transforming an adversary into an ally, which can be used only on prisoners. Finally, public relations propaganda seeks to adapt the individual to a society, to a living standard, to an activity. It sounds like a lot, but don't worry about it too much for now. Ellul says the main aim of all propaganda is to induce conformity, so maybe just keep that in mind. In order to understand how propaganda takes root, we need to first understand the distinction Ellul makes between the individualist society and the mass society. According to Ellul, for propaganda to succeed, it must be both of these types, so don't think of them as mutually exclusive. The individualist society came about in the 19th century through the disintegration of such small groups like the family and the church. The individual became increasingly isolated as the population urbanized and people increasingly left their ancestral homelands, discarding their geographic attachments to any fixed place. In the individualist society, the individual becomes the measure of all things. He is clearly responsible for his own decisions, both personal and social. This disintegration from the kinds of small traditional and kinship networks that used to help guide and direct people can sound liberating, but is experienced as a total crushing responsibility. According to Ellul, the permanent uncertainty, the social mobility, the absence of sociological protection and traditional frames of reference inevitably provide propaganda with a malleable environment. In other words, people who are socially and economically insecure or confused are easy prey for propagandists. This is made all the more pertinent as people in individualist societies are defenseless against what Ellul calls social currents. As far as I can tell, when Ellul is talking about social currents, he is basically referring to social movements. As he puts it, as a member of a small group, the individual was fairly well protected from collective influences, customs, and suggestions. He was relatively unaffected by changes in the society at large. He obeyed only if his entire group obeyed. This does not mean he was freer, but only that he was determined by his local environment and by his restricted group, and very little by broad ideological influences or collective psychic stimuli. This is the sense in which mass society depends first on the development of an individualist society. In Ellul's analysis, the Simmelian argument that the individual becomes more free when liberated from the small organic groups that dominated life in towns and villages in the pre-modern era is an erroneous one. The shedding of these anchors just left him more insecure and exposed to mass society influences like social currents and the state. Ellul thinks that this is why both Soviet and Nazi leaders found it notoriously difficult to integrate the peasantry into their ideological projects, compared to the comparatively uprooted, excitable, and socially disintegrated urban populations. Thus, we have one of the first conditions for the growth and development of modern propaganda. It emerged in Western Europe in the 19th century and first half of the 20th precisely because that was when society was becoming increasingly individualistic and its organic structures were breaking down. But for propaganda to develop, society must not be simply disintegrating, it must also be reconstituting itself towards a new structure, the mass society. Ellul is a little more straightforward when giving us a definition of mass society. As he puts it, a mass society is a society with considerable population density in which local structures and organizations are weak, currents of opinion are strongly felt, men are grouped into large and influential collectives, the individual is part of these collectives, and a certain psychological unity exists. Mass society, moreover, is characterized by a certain uniformity of material life. The men of a mass society have the same preoccupations, the same interest in technical matters, the same mythical beliefs, the same prejudices. To put it more briefly, a mass society is an emotionally volatile society in which there is a high level of uniformity in terms of psychological states, living standards, and beliefs about the world. It's not that everyone is the same, but there are huge chunks of the population that are very similar. The point Ellul is driving home is that the societies that are fertile for propaganda are both individualist and massive. In the first instance, they require a high level of individualism to break down traditional group structures and uproot the individual from being too fixed in his traditions or ancestry. This breakaway from diverse and isolated local community structures allows for the uniformity of mind, myth, and means of living that become hallmark features of the mass society and creates conditions of insecurity that can be exploited by propagandists to fill these voids with new structural or ideological bases of social life. I think this is an interesting point, because it runs counter to popular notions of the free-thinking individual who breaks away from his small-minded community to challenge tradition and custom. For Ellul, this individual is just exposing himself to a different set of socio-psychological influences. Propaganda steps in to fill the vacuum left by the death of tradition and ancestral memory. Once a mass society is created, public opinion will begin to play a role in helping individuals form their own personal opinions. But public opinion can only express itself through channels which are provided by the mass media of communication, without which there could be no propaganda. According to Ellul, public opinion has three characteristics, which are outlined as follows. First, it can shape itself only in a society in which institutionalized channels of information give the people the facts on which they will take a position. The key word here is institutionalized. The institutionalization of facts and information means that the information reaching the individual is necessarily indirect. It is passed through intermediaries in the newsrooms, PR offices, and broadcasting stations. While they may not directly tell us what to think, such institutions exercise what is possibly an even greater influence. They give people the set of facts upon which they take a position. In doing so, they exercise a tremendous yet subtle influence over the scope of public opinion and its pertinent issues. No one can really escape this, because no one can observe all of the world firsthand. The second characteristic of public opinion is that it cannot express itself directly, but only through channels. For example, elections, political parties, referenda, and newspaper associations. To me, this is actually kind of a weird assertion to make, as I would personally consider phenomena like revolutions or street protests to be spontaneous expressions of what he calls public opinion. I wish he elaborated more here rather than just asserting that it does not express itself spontaneously. The third characteristic of public opinion is that it is formed by a very large number of people who cannot possibly experience the same fact in the same fashion, who judge it by different standards, speak a different language, and share neither the same culture nor social position. Because of this diversity, public opinion most effectively forms when people are not really aware of the facts, but of symbols that substitute for them. Therefore, and this was italicized, so it's key, public opinion always rests on problems that do not correspond to reality. Rather, it rests on abstractions. The point Ellul is showing us in this section is that propaganda relies on second-hand opinion. It thrives in the ambiguous space between direct observation and symbolic interpretation, or word of mouth. Direct experience, immediate grasp of facts, and personal acquaintance between people leave no room for propaganda. Empiricism is the enemy of propaganda. The senses are not deceived as easily as information is manipulated. Propaganda can only exist in societies in which second-hand opinion is dominant. So if people find themselves conflicted about an opinion from a smaller primary group and the public opinion, they will naturally default to the public opinion. According to Ellul, propaganda cannot exist unless mass media of communications exist. Mass media is not, however, intrinsically a tool of propaganda. Two conditions must be met for mass media to become instruments of propaganda. First, they must be subjected to centralized control, and second, they must be diversified in their products. As long as a large number of independent media producers exist in the news, films, podcasts, etc., no conscious and direct propaganda is possible. This is because a healthy local newsroom, for example, can neutralize the messaging of a national press. I think Ellul uses the words conscious and direct carefully here, leaving room for unconscious and indirect forms of propaganda to still function through other avenues. In his words, to make the organization of propaganda possible, the media must be concentrated, the number of news agencies reduced, the press brought under single control, and radio and film monopolies established. Only through concentration in a few hands of a large number of media can one attain a true orchestration, a continuity, and an application of the scientific methods of influencing individuals. Whether this is a state monopoly or a private monopoly is irrelevant to the matter, as Ellul considers America to be one of the world's propaganda masters, along with China and Russia. I think this is a relevant point to keep in mind as news media ownership in the United States and elsewhere in the West has been becoming increasingly centralized over the past few decades. Ellul believed that whenever we read our favorite newspaper, tune in to our favorite political talk show, or listen to our favorite radio personality complain about the issue of the day, if we are in a media landscape conducive to propaganda, then this is likely propaganda at work. For him, propaganda is not just about changing people's minds, it's about reinforcing opinions and transforming them into action. As he dramatically put it, the reader offers his throat to the knife of the propaganda he chooses. We naturally seek out media that reinforce our myths and opinions. Even buying a TV, though an individual act, inserts the individual into the psychological and behavioral structure of the mass. So, in summary, for propaganda to function, there must be two media conditions: the concentration of the sources of propaganda and the wide diffusion of recipients across diverse channels. We now move into the second part of the chapter, objective conditions of total propaganda. According to Ellul, just as there are societies that are not susceptible to propaganda, there are also individuals who are less susceptible to it. For example, Ellul asserts that people who are very poor are more resistant to propaganda because basically, they are too busy surviving to pay attention to certain forms of propaganda that orient and domesticate people. They are, however, vulnerable to agitation propaganda and can be induced into rebellion and excited to the point of theft and murder. It's another arguable assertion, and I guess he's alluding to the Russian Revolution and Cultural Revolution. More advanced forms of propaganda, however, take hold easily among the middle class, or those who have attained an average standard of living. That makes sense, Because propaganda must target the largest mass, it may not translate neatly onto the extremely rich or poor. Ellul notes that all propagandists come from the upper middle class, be they Soviet, Nazi, Japanese, or American. This is because the upper middle class is the most culturally in tune with the average standard of living, but also privileged enough to be educated and socialized into the ranks of professionals. The wealthy and very cultured class provides nothing because it is too remote from the masses to appeal to them, and the lower classes lack education and objectivity. I think this point about the lower classes really only applies to cases of extreme poverty, where people are literally concerned with starving and may not attain a basic high school education. According to Ellul, propaganda's intent is to integrate people into the normal pattern prevailing in society and thus establish conformity in the way of life. I found this connection between normalcy, averageness, and propaganda to be really interesting because it implies that people who are deviant in their character or ways of living are harder to propagandize. Ellul identifies two types of normalcy, a communist type and an American type. The American type rests upon a scientific psychosociological analysis based on statistics. It is thus connected to pathology and medicalization. Those who are not normal are liable to be deemed sick or disordered. This is why American prisoners in the Korean War who appeared to have been contaminated by communism were hospitalized and given psychiatric and medical treatment. The communist type, on the other hand, is based on adherence to ideology and doctrine and involves the conscious submission and acceptance of the recipient to a basic standard. The results are the same. Normalcy necessarily gives rise to propaganda that can reduce the individual to the pattern most useful to society. It is not enough, however, for people to have a common standard of living. In order for propaganda to succeed in exercising its influence over the individual must to some extent possess a certain cultural base of concepts and customs that can serve as a foundation. Ellul believes education is an essential component of this kind of culturing. As he puts it, a man who cannot read will escape propaganda, as will a man who is not interested in reading. This is probably less true today than it was in the 1960s, since the dominance of the written word has been challenged by video form content, but I think the point he's making still stands. In order to be propagandized, one must be fluent and engaged in dominant modes of mass communication. Ellul cites research done by the Germans between 1933 and 1938, showing that in remote areas, where people hardly knew how to read, propaganda had no effect. You might be noticing a common theme here. People who are more insular and more disconnected from the so-called massive society have a greater resistance to propaganda. The same problem was faced by the Korean and Chinese communists with their illiterate populations, hence the state's priority in developing standardized national alphabets to replace the regional local scripts. Not only did such initiatives help create a common cultural base upon which propaganda could flourish, but they also served as an opportunity to plant the seeds of ideology. According to Ellul, the texts used to teach these new alphabets and make rural populations literate were exclusively propaganda texts. Ellul claims that this need of a certain cultural level to make people susceptible to propaganda is best understood if one looks at one of propaganda's most important devices, the manipulation of symbols. The more an individual participates in the society in which he lives, the more he will cling to stereotyped symbols expressing collective notions about the past and future of his group. I think when Ellul speaks of symbols and stereotypes, he's talking about simplified representations of complex ideas, such as slogans, ethnicity, and concepts such as national security or patriotism. Ellul believes that, ironically, intellectuals are actually some of the most vulnerable to propaganda. This is because they more than anyone are convinced that their intellectual superiority makes them immune to propaganda, and those who believe they are outside the reach of propaganda are the most likely to be victims of it. A major part of the propagandist's mission is to be subtle. Propaganda that reveals itself as such is not very good propaganda. Good propaganda should appear to be the reasonable, normal truth. The best propaganda is the kind that appears at the surface of your brain like your own thought. Propaganda can also have an effect on those who lack a common cultural base, but mostly just in the form of creating conditioned, reflexive responses. The uncultured require a qualitatively different kind of propagandizing effort than the cultured. The common belief would be that information is the antidote to propaganda, but Ellul rejects this entirely. He argues that, contrary to the simplistic differentiation between propaganda and information, in reality, to distinguish exactly between the two is impossible. Information, in his view, is actually an essential element of propaganda. For propaganda to succeed, it must have reference to some political or economic reality. Most people aren't completely stupid, and will thus be unwilling to believe or mobilize around outright lies. Additionally, just like culture, there must be a basis of information upon which propaganda can take root. If I'm supposed to hate a given country or ethnic group, I need to have some kind of information about how and why their interests are a threat to mine. This often requires extensive, if selective, information work on the part of the propagandist. Thus, information actually generates the problems that propaganda exploits, and for which it pretends to offer solutions. As he puts it, no propaganda can work until the moment when a set of facts has become a problem in the eyes of those who constitute public opinion. This problem doesn't have to actually exist, but there must be a reason why, given the facts, it might exist. This works especially well when people are confronted with problems related to abstractions that are too complicated for anyone to understand. For example, the economy. Information helps people connect the problems they experience firsthand to systemic problems faced by millions of others, and thus is essential for mobilizing people towards large-scale action. The last social condition for the development of propaganda that Ellul discusses is the prevalence of strong myths and ideologies in society. Ellul borrows his definition of ideology from Raymond Aron. An ideology is any set of ideas accepted by individuals without attention to their origin or value. In addition, ideology consists of cherished ideas relating to the present that are believed rather than proven to be true. Myths, on the other hand, are more emotive and intellectually diffuse, whereas ideologies are more passive, myths are more action-oriented. Ellul gives the examples of work, progress, and happiness as the fundamental myths, and democracy, nationalism, and socialism as fundamental ideologies. This is a very short section, but I think the takeaway is this. Ideology is a pretext for propaganda. Propaganda seizes the material that emerges spontaneously and gives it form, structure, and direction, and can transform ideology into myth. Societies that are deeply mired in myth and ideology are thus most vulnerable to propagandizing. In my reading, all of this implies that there is significant variability in the day-to-day prevalence of mythology and ideology between different societies and across historical epochs. So, anyway, that's just one single chapter of Propaganda, the Formation of Men's Attitudes. We now have a pretty good understanding of the social conditions conducive to propaganda. As you can see, it's really rich stuff, and I'd like to cover some other chapters if I ever get the time. What I like about this book is that it's very interdisciplinary and brings in a lot of historical examples. Despite being written in the 1960s, I think it also very convincingly operates at a level of abstraction that allows it to still feel applicable today, and more so if you're willing to use a little bit of imagination in extending his observations and arguments to modern contexts. Ellul shows how propaganda is both pervasive and fundamental to the form and function of the modern nation-state, rather than being some cartoonishly obvious Orwellian dystopia. Although he has plenty of reasons to have a chip on his shoulder given his experiences in World War II, you get the sense that he's just trying to figure out the phenomenon of propaganda rather than writing some partisan screed. If there's anything I don't like about this book based on my reading so far, it's that Ellul has a tendency to make fairly absolutist statements, but sometimes these statements are not fully evidenced. For example, his statement that the ultra-poor are only susceptible to agitation propaganda, in my opinion, requires much more evidence. Sometimes he will say stuff like this and just leave it there for us to roll with, which is weird because there are so many instances in this chapter where he brings in really effective historical evidence. For example, in his discussion of the Nazis' attempts to propagandize the peasantry or Mao's standardization of local alphabets. This is the kind of thing you can get away with when writing a book and not a peer-reviewed paper. But anyway, that's all I have to say about this book for now. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions or thoughts, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.